Glory to Ukraine, AFU, and death to enemies. My name is Fakhrudin Sharafmal, and I'm on the phone with legal analyst Andriy Vihirinsky to discuss important topics. Andriy, it's good to see you. And hi Farid, and happy Friday. Hello, and to everyone watching. Today we are going to discuss an interview with our president Volodymyr Zelenskyy for the South Korean channel KBS. There are some interesting points that were made. I propose that we discuss them and start with the fact that in the near future, Ukraine should present a plan to South Korea. Well, not exactly a plan, but a request for weapons that we could receive from South Korea as a result of the fact that North Korea is basically sending its troops to Russia to participate in the war against Ukraine. These are artillery, tanks, anti-aircraft systems. Basically, South Korea is rich in various weapons, and there is a lot to ask them for. But how realistic is it, given the fact that now, well, not yet, but Ukraine has actually ground South Korea's main enemy, their neighbor? It is worth noting right away that this thesis of Volodymyr Alexandrovich is explained in his other Telegram channel, which is called Zelenskyy Official, in my opinion, if I'm not mistaken. And at the end of a rather important post about the fact that there will indeed be communication, appeals, and so on, Volodymyr Alexandrovich himself makes a note that he does not know whether South Korea will respond satisfactorily to the request. In view of this, we can conclude that there are no preliminary agreements on supplies. There is also no prior consent from South Korea to strengthen our defense capabilities. There is no preliminary agreement indicating that South Korea has changed its position to supply military equipment directly, rather than through intermediaries or the U.S. Therefore, we are rather articulating the position of the Ukrainian public through the mouth of our president that we believe we are doing the right thing by asking the country that borders North Korea for help. After all, our measures related to countering North Korea's troops. We will strengthen South Korea's defense, so it would be beneficial to acquire certain weapons that South Korea produces. Is South Korea's position considered in this request? Probably not. And in this vein, given that the president did give an interview to the South Korean media, we are largely continuing on that path. The same approach was used in communication with India and in communication with, say, Kazakh media. That is, we interview or invite for an interview the media that can relay information to the territory of the country from which we expect something or with which we have certain communication. We expect that the public of this country will somehow influence the political decisions of the authorities in this country, and these decisions will be in our favor. I can't call the cases with Kazakhstan or India successful, but we're continuing our efforts due to limited options. I am deeply convinced that South Korea will not take any measures of a similar nature, no matter how much we communicate with the media. It coordinates its security policy in matters including the confrontation with North Korea, in one way or another, with the United States. And why with the United States? Because accordingly, there are certain treaty obligations related to the need for the United States armed forces to enter the conflict on the side of South Korea in the event of an escalation. And as a result, if the United States has already said, in the words of Joseph Biden, that in fact, countering North Korea is possible only if they move across the state border of Ukraine and Russia, that is on the territory of Ukraine, then we need to strike back. In this context, I read an interpretation. I don't know how reliable it is, but it seems logical. In fact, these words may conceal Joseph Biden's position that the American weapons systems in service with the Ukrainian armed forces can be used against the relevant units if they are separated from Russian units, and if they include North Koreans only if they are on the territory of Ukraine. In this context, a position from the White House has formed regarding another country, specifically military personnel interpreted as North Korean. American weapons cannot and should not be used on the territory of another country. And as a result, if North Korean troops are only going to be used on the territory of the Kurdish Peninsula, it is extremely unlikely that South Korea will provide us with its weapons directly to counter them on the territory of the Kurdish Peninsula. Security policy is coordinated with your guarantors as actions leading to conflict create obligations for both South Korea and the United States to respond. The United States, by the way, has expressed that it will respond to and defend South Korea's threats with all available means. But before responding and defending, it is necessary to work out a policy that minimizes the risks of this clash. Given that the use of weapons can be seen as risky, they will not provide them. Therefore, our president, with his Ukraine-centered position, has done everything he could, while the circumstances of objective reality indicate that our efforts will not be successful. Although we believe in this, it is basically the only thing we have to do, as they say, is to believe. But by the way, Zelensky also said that Ukraine is ready to use Kurdish territory in diplomatic steps if it has a significant effect. Let's define what a significant effect means and what it should be. We also need to consider the implications if there is no significant effect. The Kurdish territory still needs to be secured, and there are concerns about potential Russian attacks. To address this, they've involved North Korean military forces in the operation, allowing Russians to focus on other tasks while North Koreans engage with some Russian support. In other words, we are already moving toward the point where there may not be any diplomatic effect in theory. This is an interesting formulation that our president proposed through the media, because by and large, it reflects a goal or purpose that has not been clearly articulated so far. But there have been many assumptions about it. And you and I were right, more or less, when we talked about this. What was the purpose of launching an operation on the territory of Kursk with the Russian Federation's offensive forces in the east? It was a strategy to establish a strong position for negotiations, using control over part of the Kursk region as leverage for exchanges proposed. By Ukrainian authorities in talks with Russia or intermediaries. In this form, in this case, we continue to remain in the Kurdish region, despite the fact that the Russian Federation is actually concentrating its efforts and deploying its own units, plus involving third parties, including North Korea, to push us out of this territory. Therefore, Vladimir Alexandrovich confirms that what we would consider possible if we retained control over the territory of Kursk, yes, if we retained control over the territory of Kursk, we would be ready to retreat from there in exchange for something. And this exchange could be different. It could be a retreat of Russian troops or, well, the displacement of Russian troops from a certain territory that is critically important for us. This may be an issue, for example, that concerns something narrower, something sectoral, something related to the humanitarian component, or the environmental component, or the energy component, issues related to the implementation of the peace formula. But in this regard, while we are not negotiating with the Russian Federation has also put forward a point that says that as long as the situation in Kursk exists, they do not enter into any negotiations or diplomatic processes, and Vladimir Alexandrovich's thesis actually outlines for us the future in which we will try to stay in Kursk as long as possible, because we see this as a negotiating argument. If Russia views the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine as a permanent negotiating tool in international diplomacy, we see the situation in Kursk as an indefinite presence of our armed forces until we establish a foothold. So, at a certain point in the negotiations, if they take place, the Kursk factor may not be there, depending on how many troops and military efforts the Russian Federation will make to reduce our presence for how long, and we will be there for as long as we can be there. So what we would like from the President is that we would like to see our control over the Kursk region maintained during the period of negotiations or diplomatic efforts. That is desirable. Can we imagine a period when these negotiations will begin, given the current dynamics on the battlefield and the fact that we maintain this control? Well, it is difficult to talk about this for now, because following the announcement of 10 or 12,000 North Koreans, if the Kursk operation is delayed or prolonged, this number of soldiers may increase. Roughly speaking, if we consider the situation with the North Korean military as a certain, not so much a diplomatic signal, but certain diplomatic measures that send a signal to our allies that the escalation has gone beyond the territory of Ukraine and has spread to the territory of the Russian Federation, this generally allows the Russian Federation to involve a certain entity in a small military contingent. And the potential of this group, or the North Korean military forces, is up to 1 million people, and 900,000. Even if these are also inflated figures, we count 500,000 people who are not involved in hostilities. In principle, there may be more, but in today's nature of hostilities, human potential or human resources, and the number of human resources is no less significant than the issue of technological weapons. The use of North Koreans may not currently pose a significant threat, but if operations continue and the ousting of Ukrainian troops fails, Russia might seek additional support. Additionally, some media are covering this in a sensational manner.
Щодо більшої кількості суб'єктів. І більше того, я би ще додав сюди, крім фактора Північної Кореї,
In fact, this is either a historical reflection, or let's say not very appropriate sarcasm, because against the backdrop of the situation in international diplomacy, the information agenda, which concerns North Korea, yesterday Lavrov gave an interview or comment on the signing of similar agreements, but on strategic partnership, which will include military cooperation with Iran, in fact. Iran cannot be said to have significant military experience in direct combat operations, nor can its military personnel, or for that matter, the fighters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
І ці ж заяви Лаврова, вони носять дипломатичний характер, окреслюють перспективу короткочасного підписання відповідного договору, як наслідок його ратифікації.
These statements by Lavrov are diplomatic in nature, outlining the prospect of a short-term signing of the relevant agreement as a consequence of its ratification, and then the possible arrival of, representatives of the Iranian armed forces, not in the same number as the North Korean ones, but also to gain experience in the number of several thousand people. This is also a certain manifestation of escalation by expanding the number of participants. We are not saying that this will necessarily happen, but we cannot rule out a negative or pessimistic scenario. Therefore, we cannot treat these diplomatic statements by the Russian Federation in a joking, teasing, speculative way, but our media sometimes allow it. That is why the president wants to, let's say, balance the escalation that is taking place by increasing the number of participants in the war on the side of the aggressor country. However, no decisive steps have been taken to preserve the Kurdish bridgehead and to obtain more decisive assistance from our partners. In our situation and in the Russian-Ukrainian war, absolutely nothing can be ruled out because today they have one agreement, tomorrow there may be another, then a third, and so on. Plus, it is important to pay attention to what is happening in the world, such as the elections in the United States. Zelensky says he is confident that if Trump wins the election, or rather, if he wins the election, if he wants to end the war by forcing Ukraine to give up its territories, he will not succeed. But how can we be sure that we will be able to convince Trump otherwise if we depend on their help? I realize that guessing is a very thankless task, but the U.S. election is literally in 4 days, next Tuesday, November 5th. In some key states, Trump is ahead of Kamala Harris, and his position is known. You can argue that Trump is unpredictable, but he seems to have a clear and consistent position. The issue is that we don't like it, and currently there's little we can do about it. Even Trump's personal communications with key figures haven't led to changes.
Дональда Трампа з Володимиром Олександровичем, а також з Андрієм Борисовичем Єрмаком теж не призвела до того, що
As J.D. Vance continues to express views we also disagree with.
висловлював позицію, яка нам знову ж таки не подобається.
Therefore, based on the fact that we cannot change the situation with the position that is publicly articulated, we announce to our civil society, as well as to our citizens in general, to maintain morale, assurances that Trump's actions will not lead to consequences that would be negative for us and are illegal for us. They are related, and this is extremely important, exclusively to the sovereign will of Ukraine, and are related to territorial change in territorial integrity. If we try to interpret Mr. Volodymyr Alexandrovich's words in terms of the absolute sovereignty of any country, including Ukraine, each sovereign, i.e. the people, delegates powers to the respective elected authorities. In our case, it is the president, the sovereign, who independently determines both the fate of his own territories and the fate of his domestic and foreign policy. The issue of territorial integrity, according to our constitution and social agreement, falls exclusively within the competence of the people and is resolved through a nationwide referendum. The will of another country, including Mr. Trump, does not influence decisions that are the exclusive competence of the people. Thus, the president asserts that if Trump seeks to end the war by addressing territorial issues, he will not succeed. This is correct, as decisions on territory
закінчити війну, яка включає в себе в тому числі питання відмови від території, в нього нічого не вдасться. Ну і він правий, бо питання, які стосуються відмови від території чи зміни території,
and status are solely within the authority of Ukraine and its leaders, not the U.S. president.
Керівництво народу України, а не обраного народом Сполучених Штатів президента Сполучених Штатів.
At the same time, in matters of absolute sovereignty, there is always a certain mirror image that is directly related to what is the exclusive competence and authority of a country's leader elected in democratic elections in another country. In his case, there is also full sovereignty in matters of domestic and foreign policy, and in this context, Trump may not really end the war. He may only end the aid, and that's it. then absolute sovereignty will collide with Ukrainian sovereignty, including the issue of resources to achieve your domestic and foreign policy goals. Further, I don't think you need to be an extremely deep philosopher to understand the logic of events related to the change in the U.S. policy regarding support for Ukraine, and who can replace it in this way in this particular period of time, not sometime in the future. For example, in a certain number of years, the European Union may become an independent military power with its own armed forces and security system, with all the things that it does not have now. But the fighting and the war will not be paused until this X moment in time and space, which may or may not come at some point. Under such conditions, the end of the war on Trump's initiative will not happen for Ukraine, but the United States' participation in the war on the side of Ukraine on Trump's initiative may well happen. This is an extreme issue, as extremes often involve many nuances. However, we're discussing a purely scientific and theoretical concept regarding how policies are implemented and by whom in other countries. Therefore, the President of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine can do what they can, and the level of support, it depends on Trump and the people of the United States, whether this level of support will grow or increase compared to what is available today or what has been allocated today. After all, the draft budget, as we know, for the 25th year does not contain additional funding for Ukraine, or rather, it does not contain any funding at all. And in this regard, it is Biden's policy and his administration rather than Trump's policy. And if he does, he will be the implementer of Joseph Biden's policy. Well, now we have a part of the public that will say that Kamala could be different, maybe. And that's why for a Ukrainian positive outcome, it is necessary that Americans elect the Democratic candidate. Yesterday, Mr. Kuleba, speaking about the strong belief of the presidential candidate, as of today, Kamala Harris, who was then the Vice President of the United States, also shared some rather specific insights about her belief in the outbreak of the war and the prospects for its end. And they are not positive. Not to mention the fact that today, Kamala Harris does not speak out at all on issues of support for Ukraine, determination, increased aid, and so on. It notes that it is actually a continuation of Joseph Biden's policy, and Joseph Biden's policy is the aid package that remains unused, and in fact, the amount of aid that does not allow changing the course of hostilities in favor of Ukraine. Therefore, it is not yet known what is worse or better.
Тут же, знаєш, невідомо, що гірше чи краще.
The U.S. policy aims to end the war while upholding UN principles, specifically non-recognition of territorial expansions achieved through force. Trump's willingness to engage with Russia on security or the incremental aid from Democrats leads to instability and fails to create a clear vision for the future.
Чи капельна допомога від демократів, яка веде до руйнувань,
That is, what they are making efforts to do is to continue to exhaust Russia, and perhaps someday it will give up its initiatives on the battlefield or in terms of expansion. But again, this is a very uncertain policy. It is not proactive, but rather passive, while maintaining all possible restrictions on our know-how on the battlefield or attempts to change the situation. Because Kursk, where we started our discussion, was also one of the attempts to change the trend in the policy of our partners, to support us in deterring the Russian enemy to a certain proactive position, where we can get an additional impetus in the form of weapons, finance, and demonstrate that it is worth entering into negotiations or diplomacy from a position of strength. But this initiative was not supported either verbally or effectively in terms of what we call a victory plan. So, choosing between what is called a horrible scenario, which is a straightforward scenario, and what is camouflaged by assurances that we will do whatever it takes to make the final result good. But in the context of no weapons, no money, and the restrictions that remain, and with this and that and so on, you cannot say that one or the other option has any competitive advantage. In my opinion, I started thinking about this just last night and this morning, and the only word that comes to mind to characterize what is happening now, in particular with these plans, is bacchanalia, a global bacchanalia so far. Let's say there is Ukraine, and it says, look, it's chaos everywhere, there's nothing.
Знаєш, я от буквально вчора ввечері і сьогодні зранку, тобто я вчора ввечері почав про це думати, і в мене єдине слово, яке...
And so Ukraine is demonstrating. We have done it. We are showing a clear plan of what needs to be done. Because you don't offer it. Those don't want it. Those don't want it. You see it your way. We see it our way. But we have developed a plan. We are told accordingly, no, your plan is not like that. It doesn't suit us. We don't like it. We need to redo it. But in the world, there is no plan as such, and they cannot move inertly in this situation. There must be some vision of how the situation is developing. What will happen if, for example, there is plan A, plan B, and plan C?
Має бути якесь бачення того, як розвивається ситуація, що буде, якщо, наприклад, буде план А, план Б і план С.
Why do you think time is a change that doesn't matter?
Ти вважаєш, що час – це та перемінна, яка значення не має.
In this logic, discussing the world's inertia means viewing the situation through the lens of time and your own interests. The time frame may remain undefined. Just as we discussed history and the 3 points for the next summit, we view time as a variable that could introduce unexpected changes. We initially planned a second summit to address all 7 points, but now we've split it into at least one more summit, considering that time might bring new, favorable developments for us, which the world also recognizes.
Часу, який може принести щось нове. Оце щось нове буде на нашу користь.
What goals we need to achieve, by supporting Ukraine.
Шляхом підтримки України.
The world does not set a goal of military victory in 2025. The world is looking at the situation in case the sanctions work. Ukraine manages to maintain its territory. The enemy is advancing, but it has not yet reached Kyiv. And it's going at this rate. Even intensive may continue for several more years. There have been such publications saying that maybe he will give it up, or maybe he will get exhausted, or maybe there will be economic problems. Time, yes, and this uncertainty is quite acceptable to the civilized world or to our partner countries from the point of view of their observation and non-involvement in the war. They don't engage their armed forces, so while refining weapon production and addressing diplomatic and internal political issues, little changes for them. Even the loss of Ukrainian personnel or territory isn't a personal tragedy for them.
Для них втрата особового складу Збройних сил України чи території України – це не їх особиста трагедія. Це фактично,
This is actually, let's say, the damage that is somehow inflicted during the war, because the war is not taking place on their territory. So why do we assume that the Western world, which supports us, has a plan with clear deadlines and an ultimate goal that may not coincide with ours? And it will not actually coincide with ours. And this is obvious because we need to stop the war as soon as possible. A, stop the war. B, stop it on our terms. C, stop it, including by military means, or by forming a certain strong position that will allow us to get everything we want in diplomacy. But the most important thing is that we have a very short and insignificant time frame. The situation in the world is completely different. Any decisions regarding the end of the war will not be made by them, but by Ukraine. As a result, the risks are theirs. All the time, they are supporting from the point of view of their taxpayers. They are the ones who support democracy, who support the war. If the risks and consequences of the war in terms of territory, human losses, and the country's potential are not their losses, but the losses of the other side, then they have little to lose. Reputation is a relative issue. In terms of reputation, the UK faces lawsuits over its slave trade history, which it acknowledges without shame. Similarly, the US does not shy away from this aspect of its past. Regardless of how deplorable it seems, reputation evolves over time. What may be viewed negatively today can change in future historical cycles, leading to renewed dominance. The question is not whether you fall, the question is whether you get up. Yes, in terms of reputation. That's why this is a perfectly acceptable scenario. It just doesn't fit ours. And we are fully committed to recognizing this, and we do not evaluate our ability to directly perceive the consequences in material terms, that is, those that exist in material reality or in the real world, in relation to our country or our socio-cultural economic space. We express gratitude to our partners for their support, but we also recognize that commitments, like staffing brigades and supplying air defense, often go unfulfilled. This lack of results shapes a clear, albeit unarticulated opinion within society. Just because we don't like something doesn't mean it isn't present.
А ця чітка думка веде до певного наслідку, він не артикульований в суспільстві. Він десь існує, можливо, на зародковому якомусь етапі, але він не артикульований. Ось, тому, знову ж таки, те, що нам не подобається, не означає,
It may simply not meet the expectations of our partners.
Наші партнери.
I would say that we have reached a philosophical conclusion. Listen, we had an almost academic dialogue today, with high words that people refuse to watch to the end. Is it harder for you to express yourself? In any case, there is something to think about if you look at it in this way. Andriy, thank you for the conversation. We wish everyone a good weekend.